All right. Well, everyone, we're going to get rolling here. I want to start by welcoming you back to Capital Connection. We're talking today with Becca Marr. Becca is the president of the Sustainable Michigan Fund, which is a 501c4 nonprofit that focuses on ballot issues. And she is the campaign manager for Vote Yes for Michigan, Water, Wildlife, and Parks. This is a ballot question before the voters in November of this year. And our work together has really focused on building up both the 501c4 and the campaign simultaneously. So Becca has been both a nonprofit administrator, which was a new role for you, right? and campaign manager, which is not a new role for you. Becca has been leading state legislative races. We've known each other now for 4 or 5 years that we've worked together. She's an extraordinary campaigner, and she's really doing an outstanding job in terms of leading our work here. Also want to say, today is September 11th, and it's a day of memoriam for all of us. So if we could take just a moment here and think about the tragedy of 9/11, the friends that many of us lost in that, and how far we've come from that day. "9/11 certainly shaped a lot of us, and Becca, I can imagine for you and your generation, that is a signature moment in your lives."
Yeah, it absolutely is. I've been sort of reflecting on where I was that day and how I was feeling and how my community reacted today a lot.
Yeah. You are leading a coalition now, 47 organizations, environmental and conservation groups, of course, at the heart of this fight for expanding and preserving the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund. We've been joined by labor organizations and business organizations and a variety of social justice organizations. This really is a ballot question that has extraordinarily broad appeal. Before we get into things, Becca, can you just describe for folks on the call what Proposal A is and what it does?
Absolutely. So the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund was created in the 1970s to take royalties from oil and gas from public lands and put it into this trust fund to then fund land acquisition and conservation and recreational development. So it's been a really successful program since then. It's impacted the entire state. It's funded projects in all counties across the state, and it has a lot of bipartisan support in the legislature and across communities. And this trust fund reached its cap in 2011, so it's no longer receiving new royalties. Those are now going into the State Park Endowment Fund, which has a similar mission of land acquisition and state park development and operations. And so this proposal was passed through the legislature in 2018 unanimously and is now going to be on the ballot as Proposal 1 this November for voters to approve, which is exciting. We just got our proposal number. We can say that now. And so what it'll do is it'll remove the cap on the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund so it can continue receiving these royalties once the State Park Endowment Fund reaches its own cap. So it can continue receiving funding, and we're guaranteeing a constitutionally mandated source of funding for conservation and recreation for future generations. And the second main thing that it would do if passed is to create more flexibility within the grant application and funding process, so that it opens up a little bit more opportunity for recreational development funding. That can include things like non-motorized pathways, accessible boat launches, just ways for people to interact with and engage with the outdoors. It also allows a little bit more flexibility with funding our green spaces in urban areas where there's not always necessarily a need for land acquisition, but there is a need for sort of restoring and creating outdoor spaces in our cities, which is great for clean air, clean water, public health, and creating a relationship with people in the outdoors. So those are the two main things. it's sort of tweaking a program that's already been in place that unfortunately a lot of people are not familiar with. So that's why we're running the campaign, is to educate voters about what the trust fund has already done, and what this proposal would change, and try to get the word out before the election, whether absentee voting or on election day.
I'm gonna put in a little plug too for MEC here. We have our annual event coming up on October 1st, where we recognize a significant environmental leader in the movement, and we do recognition of a leading volunteer. Our Milliken Award winner this year is Bill Rustum, and Bill was really instrumental in the 1970s in the creation of the trust fund, and he's been involved in every trust fund ballot campaign since. So changing the scope and securing it. He's actually been really active with us as well this year. So excited to honor Bill. We also at MEC put together an education project on the trust fund, and we worked with Second Wave Media to do stories about a variety of places and sort of the signature opportunities that the trust fund has been able to create for Michigan citizens. And Doug Combe, who is the photographer for Second Wave, has captured some really beautiful shots of trust fund investment sites that I want to share with you. This is in Detroit. We talk a lot about Milliken State Park and the Adventure Center. This is one of my favorites. This is Mount Elliot Park, and what you're looking at is a pirate ship, or not a pirate ship, excuse me, because we don't have pirates in Michigan, right? But it is an old a replica of a ship in Michigan that kids can play on. It's got a little wheel and water spouts and whatnot. And that was a redevelopment site in the city of Detroit. This is the Flint River Trail. For those of you who are familiar with the storied history of the Flint River, you know it had become a dumping ground for toxics, and we were really grateful to see the trust fund invest along with the city and the county and others in Mott Foundation and others in restoration of the natural corridor along that river. It's certainly one of the early steps necessary to restoring urban green space. And then, of course, one of the most iconic places in Michigan, up in Leland, at Leland State Park, the lighthouse there, which I have only visited in the coldest and windiest of times, where the landscape is very dramatic. This shot Doug took looks extraordinarily peaceful. I can understand how one might tempt a lighthouse keeper to a place like this, and not tell them what February was like. Trust fund has made more than $1 billion of investments in places like this over its 40-year history. And we've got an opportunity now to secure that for the future. Becca, you said the Michigan Natural Resource Trust Fund has reached its cap of $500 million. There is an opportunity still for oil and gas revenues to flow into the State Park Endowment Fund, but what happens when the Park Endowment Fund reaches its cap?
Yep, so the Park Endowment Fund also does have a cap, like you said. So currently, I believe the legislation or the Constitution mandates that the royalties would go as directed by statute, I think is the language, or something along those lines. But there is no actual direction yet. And so it would just no longer flow into either of those funds unless something is changed. It would no longer be secured as conservation and recreation funding. It would go back to the general fund and be up to the legislature. And so we don't know, we can't know exactly when the State Park Endowment Fund cap will be reached. It will depend on sort of demand and pricing, and we don't know exactly what will happen in the next few years or decades even. And so what we do want to make sure is that we're being proactive so that no matter how long that takes to reach the cap, when it is reached, we have a plan for where the money continues to go. So it will, if passed, once the State Park Endowment Fund reaches its own cap, the royalties will flow back into the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund so that the trust fund can continue to grow and provide more funding opportunities for land acquisition and recreation.
So we got great message for the campaign. I'm going to share with everybody the commercial that, oops, I didn't do this right. Excuse me. Let me try this one more time. That just came out this week, right, Becca?
Yeah,
It's
Very excited to have launched our paid advertising this past week on Wednesday, so that we can start getting in front of voters more as absentee ballots are going to be heading out soon.
Let's see if I can make this work.
Clean
I got too
forests
fast.
and parks, natural clean water, forests and parks, natural habitats for wildlife. They're all part of why we love.
Hey, can you hear that?
For
Is it
decades, the
working?
Michigan
I can hear it, but it is glitchy. But it was getting better, so maybe try it one more time.
Yep. Let me. Sorry, everyone. This is the first time I've done this kind of a share, and I'm apparently not as experienced as I should be. So bear with me 1 second, Becca. I apologize for not being more adept at this.
No problem. I'm going to take this opportunity to pitch everyone checking out our website as you're trying to work through this. After, of course, after this is over, it's miwaterwildlifeparks.com, and it has a lot of information about the proposal and the trust fund. And then we have social media pages, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter as well, which this ad is on. So if you want to take a second look, you can always find it there.
All right, let's try this again.
Clean water, forests and parks, natural habitats for wildlife. They're all part of why we love Michigan. For decades, the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund has invested in protecting, building, and maintaining Michigan's Great Lakes and great outdoors. Protecting sources of drinking water without raising taxes. Now we must ensure future generations can enjoy the places we love by voting yes on Proposal 1 for Michigan Water, Wildlife, and Parks on November 3rd or absentee.
Okay, you have to tell me, Becca, did the audio come through there? Because I couldn't hear it on my end.
Yeah, I heard it.
All right.
Okay, you can always check it out on our Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, and hopefully you'll start seeing it as an ad as well.
Cross our fingers. Let's talk a little bit about the environmental justice issues. You mentioned that there's a change in the language that's proposed that would allow, currently the way the trust fund works, 25% of the funds must be spent on land acquisition, and up to 25%, but capped at 25%, is allowed to be spent on development and redevelopment activities. The proposal would make a floor of 25% for both of those. So minimum 25% acquisition, minimum 25% for development and redevelopment. What do you think the positives of that are from an environmental justice standpoint?
I think the positives are that it frees up a lot of flexibility around funding recreational development projects that, again, can allow more opportunity to create green spaces and rehabilitate green spaces in our cities, where that is more of a demand than large acquisition projects. And it also, one other change that I didn't mention earlier is that it adds renovation and redevelopment as well as development into the recreational development sort of piece of the trust fund. And so a lot of our assets across the state were created around the same generation. And so this, oftentimes it's more cost effective for communities and for the state to fix up, rehabilitate our trails and parks and community playgrounds than it is to start from scratch. So that's not exactly an answer to your question, but I did want to add that in there.
I appreciate that. That's great.
And so, you know, it is very important to continue focusing on land acquisition and conservation. And this proposal does not reduce the amount that's available for that. So right now it's at least 25%, and that will continue to be the case. At least 25% of annual expenses are available for land acquisition. And this change, like you said, it matches that for recreational development. So now we can ensure that at least 50% of every annual expenses are going towards conservation and access to our outdoor spaces. Because another purpose for the trust fund dollars is administration and payments and those sorts of things. And so we do want to make sure that at least half are going to the things the reason why the trust fund was created in the first place. And so it allows that flexibility in funding. It allows us to invest in our population centers in our cities where people can't necessarily drive up north, and they don't necessarily have houses up north, and they still deserve access to green spaces and the health that comes along with that, and the relationship to nature that comes along with that. So this proposal, if passed, would allow us to invest more in that sort of thing.
We had a question in the Q&A about boat launches and boat washes that I don't know the answer to. Do you, Becca? Does the trust fund funding extend to boat washes, or is that something we should follow up on?
I think we should follow up on that. It does, to the extent that it creates or can go into the development of those boat launches and the infrastructure, whether or not it includes boat washes. I think the money would probably go towards that, but the sort of operations of it on a regular basis, trust fund dollars do not fund operations.
Right, that's a really important point. The Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund cannot be used for maintenance, and it cannot be used for operations. So when we're talking about development and redevelopment, we're talking about restoration of dilapidated facilities in their entirety. So 40 years ago, when we first started purchasing lands, for example, and creating access to these places, some of those facilities, be they trails, for example, or trailheads, may have fallen in such disrepair that they need to be completely redeveloped. Melissa also asked about restoring green spaces and invasive species work. And yes, under the development and redevelopment funding scheme, we would be able to do invasive species work to restore the natural habitats, the original natural habitats of these places that we're purchasing. So that was an important part of the conversation for the environmental community, for sure. Becca, there's a question about assisting in the development of non-motorized trails. And the question is the intent to provide more opportunities to develop motorized vehicle trails, for example, for ORVs and snowmobiles? And I don't think that is the intention there.
I don't think it's necessarily the intention, but I do think that would probably fall under recreational development. I'd have to double check, but the Constitution doesn't specifically list out what is and is not included. That's the trust fund has a sort of grading process where they review the proposals and they match it against priorities that are preset, and then decide what to recommend, and then that gets passed through the legislature. So those sort of like what exactly the focus is as far as recreation is more up to the trust, or it's a little bit more fluid. It's not in the Constitution, but the purpose is to create the flexibility to have opportunities for people to get outside and enjoy green spaces and exercise. And I think we're making use of these outdoor areas a lot more right now. So hopefully that gives you more of an appreciation for the work that Michigan has done in the past in investing in access, and hope to continue improving that going forward.
You made a very, very important point that the constitutional language is very broad, and it allows the legislature to establish rules through the Natural Resource and Environmental Protection Act that guide the expenditures of the fund. And of course, the trust fund itself, the trust fund board, sets up its own rules and criteria. So regardless of whether this change passes or not, there's still a call for engagement and for vigilance, making sure that we have excellent trust fund board members. I know some of them are actually on the past and present are on the call today, and to make sure we're paying attention to the legislature. I'm going to keep rolling through our Q&A here. Is it expected that if this passes, there will be an increase in annual trust fund dollars available? I think the short answer to that is no. Trust fund revenues are built off of the royalties that we receive from non-renewable resource extraction on that land. And those royalty revenues are extraordinarily volatile. So in a given year, we might receive $40 million in royalties, or we might receive $200 million in royalties, as we did in 2010. So there's a whole lot of variety in the amount of money that comes into the trust fund in a given year, and that sort of drives their budget decision making.
And currently, while there's no new revenues going into the trust fund, just the interest is expended on an annual basis. Once the state, if this passes, if the State Park Endowment Fund reaches its cap, the royalties start going back into the trust fund. Then it becomes both the interest and half of the annual revenue from those royalties can be expended. So like Conan said, it totally depends, and it's very volatile, but assuming that
right.
there will at least be new opportunities for funding from the revenue and not just from the interest.
Can you talk a little bit about the polling that the campaign has done and where the people of Michigan stands on the ballot question, as far as we know?
So we did polling earlier, sort of in the middle of the summer, and we're really happy with the results. Across geography, demographics, political, partisan standing, there's support for the proposal. It is clear that there is a need to educate voters on what exactly this will do, because there's, as you sort of transition it into plain English explanation, that support increases. And so that's the goal, is there's support for this across the board, and we just need to make sure we're communicating clearly what the changes would be, what the trust fund is in general, and also, it's a very crowded political field right now. And so cutting through that noise to make sure people know that this is even on the ballot is going to be really important. So we're excited and motivated by the polling, but not by any means taking that further.
Right. There's a question about opposition, and you and I, the day before yesterday, had a tough but good conversation with the policy leadership team at the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club has come out in opposition to the proposal. Can you share a little bit about what they told us?
Sure. So as we've talked about, the proposal would change the funding formula from at most 25% going towards recreational development to at least 25% going towards recreational development, which in the Sierra Club's perspective is a shift away from the focus on specifically land acquisition. So while it doesn't change the amount, it doesn't change the fact that land acquisition will continue to be at least 25% available. Just the sort of priorities of the Sierra Club don't match up with the changes in the proposal.
I want to point out, like, that's a very principled position that they took, and they were great when we talked to them about it, very curious about other aspects of the trust fund and what we could be collaborating on to strengthen the focus on urban recreation, for example. Short of doing this ballot question, we just weren't able to navigate ourselves to a point of agreement. You have pretty much all of the rest of the conservation and environmental community backing the coalition campaign, though, right?
Yeah, we have, I think now we're up to 50 organizations endorsing the proposal and growing, and absolutely accepting more support and endorsements if anyone listening is interested in getting involved. So we have the core group of organizations that sort of started up this campaign are MEC, the Nature Conservancy, Michigan United Conservation Clubs, MParks, which is the Parks and Recreation Association, Michigan Trails and Greenways Alliance, and Heart of the Lakes, which is the voice for a lot of the land conservancies across the state. So that coalition is the core of the campaign. We've been growing and expanding since then. Like Conan said, we have a lot of conservation and environmental and hunt and fish groups. We've also been able to secure the endorsement of some business leaders and organizations. We got SEIU endorsement for labor, and are reaching out to community leaders and community groups, civics organizations across the state, because again, our goal is to educate voters on what this proposal is, and we need to make sure we're using all of the channels available to us to do that, because it's hard to cut through. There's a lot going on right now, and people's priorities are all across the board, and so making sure we're able to reach everyone where they are. Growing this list of endorsers and spokespeople and sort of leaders and champions for the proposal is one of our main goals right now.
a lot of us in the environmental community are rightfully concerned about climate change and are pushing hard for a transformation in our energy portfolio. So we're hopeful and expectant that at some point oil and gas are not the primary drivers of energy in the United States and across the world. And that would have an impact, of course, on trust fund revenues. Do you foresee a loss of purchasing power for the trust fund in the future because of this?
Our general stance is that as long as these royalties are coming to the state from oil and gas, we want to make sure that they're being reinvested back into conservation and our land and our recreation and access to the outdoors. And so a lot of people have posed that question, and again, we can't see into the future to see exactly how our reliance on oil and gas is going to change or not. But if this continues to be money that the state receives, we just want to make sure the money continues to go to this program that has worked really well since it was created in the 70s.
Yeah, I think that is a critically important point. We talked about the two caps, and there's about $500 million left before we hit the cap in the state park endowment fund, at which point, as we discussed, the money would be at the whim of the legislature to spend. There are projections that could take 20 years or 30 years, in which time frame we would certainly hope that we'd be able to transform that energy future. But our experience with the trust fund and our understanding of the volatility of those energy prices, it could happen in as few as 3 years. We've seen hundreds of millions of dollars poured into the trust fund from royalties in a very short period of time. We're in a down cycle right now. We don't know if we'll stay in that down cycle. So I think it's really important that we be prepared in the short term to make sure that any additional royalties beyond those caps are captured for the Natural Resources Trust Fund. And I would say, regrettably, we're still seeing increases in the use of oil and gas. Hydrocarbon usage has changed as a percentage of our overall portfolio, but people around the world are just using more energy. And so the gross amount of oil and gas that's being utilized has actually continued to climb. So we have a lot of work to do on the climate change front here as well still.
I think that there's a gray box on the screen that's visible. I don't know if that's something that you're able to move or not. No, just right.
Oh, you can't see the presentation?
We see a little on the right and a little on the left, and then a gray box.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm sorry, folks. I didn't realize that that gray box is the Q&A box for the chat.
It was just.
So let me throw this back up and so that you can see the learn more opportunities. Becca, we're at the hour. This was really fast, and we have probably another dozen questions. So why don't you and I capture these questions from the webinar, and we'll ask Eli Fedorchuk, our communications director, to reach out to everyone who registered, and we'll answer those questions via email to the best of our ability and provide additional contact information for folks. Becca, thank you for taking the time to talk about your campaign. It's been really great.
Thank you for inviting me, and thanks to MEC for being a huge part of the campaign. And I'm excited that people are so interested in learning about the proposal as we're getting closer to Election Day.
Hear, hear. Thank you all for joining in and participating. Look for the follow-up email from us with the additional questions, and we will stay in touch. Have a great weekend and a peaceful and thoughtful September 11th.